I'm Tyler Austin from Gungnir Strategic. Thank you so much for watching. In this video, I'm going to be talking about shoulder transitions, particularly within the context of CQB. This is really going to be like a two-part video. Basically, the first part is going to be asking whether or not you should do shoulder transitions. And then the second part is, if yes, when should you do them? So to answer the first part, well, for that question, it's going to be very personal. It's going to be really up to you in terms of how well you work from your offside. So the questions you're going to have to ask is, A, what do you actually gain from working on your offside? And for that, it's going to be exposure management primarily. Because if you're working an angle from your dominant side, you're going to have a lot less exposure than if you're working it from your non-dominant side. However, if you do a shoulder transition on paper and in theory, you should have the same exposure as if you were working from your dominant side because it's the same position. However, most of the time, I will say that tends to not really be the case for most people because working from your non-dominant side tends to be very awkward in terms of just even movement. Even though it's technically the same position, a lot of people find this very awkward to work and therefore it makes their movement very clumsy. I shouldn't say clumsy, but it's just not as smooth as they were working on their dominant side. And a lot of times this doesn't really lead to a lot of exposure, to better exposure management. It just doesn't. A lot of times actually people tend to have better exposure management while rolling over and working from their dominant side because it's just more natural for them. Now, the next equation, or the next part of the equation, is going to be how well do you shoot from your non-dominant side. And that's a big one because I don't care what anybody says, no, there's not a person on this earth that shoots as well from their offside as they do from their dominant side. However, it's going to be a question on how much ability do I lose in terms of shooting, and is it acceptable for the exposure management that I gain? You know, you might not shoot as well, but you might shoot good enough to the point where it's acceptable and you're willing to take that hit for the gain of exposure management. And whether or not you choose to do shoulder transitions is, again, totally up to you, and neither one is wrong. For me personally, I don't do shoulder transitions at all. They're just not worth it to me. So basically, there's no point in which I do a shoulder transition. They're just not worth it to me. However, some people, it is worth it to them, and that's totally okay as long as you're reasonable and rational in terms of your ability to work from your offside. There are other questions you should ask yourself too in terms of whether or not you should do shoulder transitions. A big one is going to be how good are you at actually acquiring a dot or a sight picture. A lot of people really struggle with that from their offside, especially under stress. So you should definitely force it and put yourself under some stress, because under stress, your dominant eye becomes more dominant. And a lot of times your dominant side becomes more dominant too. So the differences between dominant and non-dominant side really exacerbate themselves under stress. And that also includes eye dominance. A lot of people under stress will struggle to find dots. So lasers can fix this. So different aiming devices and tools, particularly lasers, can fix that. But if you're just running dots and stuff, that's something to consider. You may find it very difficult to find that dot under stress from your non-dominant eye. So just some questions to ask. Now let's move on to, let's just say you've decided that, yes, I'm going to do shoulder transitions. So now it becomes a question on when should you do them. And as a general prescription, I'm going to say this. Shoulder transitions are going to be best when you are in a static defensive position. Meaning, let's just say I am holding security from this threshold, whether that be down a hallway or whatever, it's kind of irrelevant. So right now, again, I'm in a position where I'm static and basically holding a defensive position. This is a good time to do a shoulder transition because it's generally the safest time to do it, especially if I know I'm going to be here for a little while for whatever reason. Now, once I get a squeeze and we're going to, perform the next course of action, before I make entry back into, let's just call this a hallway, I'm going to transition back to my dominant side and then move to do the next action. Like if we're just going to make a broad oversweeping prescription, shoulder transitions are going to be most appropriate when you're in a static defensive position. And as a general rule, you should be hesitant to do transitions when taking ground. However, there are, of course, times when you want to do it. It's going to be all about timing, really, and when it's appropriate. So, for example, you know, if I'm holding this angle from within this room right now, doing a shoulder transition right now is a little bit dangerous because as I'm doing that transition, I'm vulnerable. It might not be for a very long period of time, but let's just even call it a second. For that second that I am doing that shoulder transition, I am vulnerable, and it comes down to like Murphy's Law, you know, as I'm in the middle of that transition, some dude's gonna pop out of that angle. You know, let's just say I'm back here and I don't have any exposure to this room yet, and I haven't, you know, approached it to begin to work it. Right now, this is a safer position to do this transition before I begin actually gaining any exposure to this room. It's going to be the same thing with like closed doors. So right now I'm on the weak side or the support side of the door. If I want to work this room after doing a transition, I'm going to do the transition before I open this door rather than after. It'd be really stupid for me to go ahead and just open this door, have exposure to the room, and then do the transition. So if I want to transition to work this room, I'm going to transition first because I'm on the side of the door where I open, right? I'll go ahead and open that door and then work this room from the transition. But I'm going to do the transition prior to opening the door. It's just a smarter position, obviously, and a smarter time to do the transition rather than after opening the door. Again, it all comes down to appropriate timing and context when you do the transition. Now, in terms of, because I know some people ask, well, what about entries? Personally, I don't think you should ever make entry from your non-dominant side. There's just no advantage or benefit to it. So if I did work this room from a transition prior to making an entry, I'm going to go ahead and swap shoulders just before I make entry. Because again, especially when you're making entry and attacking a corner, you want to have as much shooting ability as you can. Attacking that corner from your non-dominant side, just in my opinion, isn't terribly smart. So if you're asking my opinion, which is what you're here for, always make entry from your dominant side. Anyways, that's just my brief rundown on shoulder transitions, on whether or not you should do them, and if so, when. Hope you found this video helpful and informative. If you did, please like and subscribe. I'm Tyler Austin from Gungnir Strategic. Thank you so much for watching.